The recent terror attacks in Paris have once again given rise to a heated debate about the nature of collective responsibility, despite widespread condemnation of the attacks by various Muslim leaders and organizations. A sense persists among some that Muslims should have been more forthcoming with expressions of sorrow and responsibility. Following that logic, should the world see all Norwegian Christians take responsibility for Anders Breivik's massacre? Anyway, let's get into this. Joining us now to help us understand this most complex subject, we welcome, in Canterbury, UK, via Skype, Frank Furedi, Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of Kent and the author most recently of First World War, No End in Sight. Also, via Skype, from Arlington, Virginia, Maha Hilal, Deputy Executive Director of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms. In our nation's capital, Shima Khan, monthly columnist for the Globe and Mail and author of Hockey and Hijab, Reflections of a Canadian Muslim Woman. And with us here in studio, Jordan Peterson, Professor of Psychology at the University of Toronto. Shima and Jordan, welcome back to the program. It's good to see both of you again. And Professor Furedi and Ms. Hilal, good to have you on our program for the first time. And may I say to Ms. Hilal, good to have you on television for the first time. You're making your broadcast debut tonight, so let's put you to work right away. Some months ago, you came up with a hashtag called Muslim Apologies. Let's just start by having you tell us what the idea was behind that.
Sure. So I want to take a step back and talk first about the fact that I've done research for my PhD dissertation, and my research was specifically about Muslim American responses to the war on terror. And in doing this research, one of the themes and one of the feelings that was expressed by participants in my research was this idea of collective responsibility, that no matter what, whenever there's an attack that's perpetrated by a Muslim, Muslims are expected to respond with some kind of condolence, some kind of apology, etc. So this is just something that has been on my mind repeatedly, especially as various events have continued to evolve around the world. With that in mind, I decided one day, for some reason, I was thinking about this issue of collective responsibility and the fact that, again, that we're expected to apologize for everything. So what I did was I made a joke. I made this T-shirt that said, I'm Muslim and I'm sorry for everything in the past, present, and future. To my surprise, this message resonated with a lot of Muslims. And the response was enormous when we began the conversation on Facebook, and then we transferred it over to Twitter, and it blossomed. It became a viral hashtag, showing that Muslims all around the world were really just sick and tired of having to be put in this position, and a position that other groups are never put in the same way.
Let me do a quick follow-up on that. I don't know if you saw, but also on Twitter, after you did that, there was another hashtag, perhaps in response to what you were doing, that said, "Not in my name." And I wondered whether you had a problem with Muslims trying to distance themselves from terrorist actions by saying they don't represent us.
Well, I think with respect to that hashtag, I think it represents in a lot of ways the context in which Muslims are in at this current point. So they feel compelled, for whatever reason, to condemn the attacks. While I mourn the loss of innocent lives, I categorically reject that approach. So in a way, yes, my hashtag was responding to that. And I think actually their hashtag began before mine did. So it was partly a response to that and partly a response to the general context that was, whatever we were dealing with at that point.
Understood. Okay, Shima Khan, let's go to you in Ottawa. I wonder what your view is on this notion of collective responsibility regarding the events that just took place in Paris, or for that matter, the events of last October in the city in which you find yourself.
Well, as a Muslim, I don't believe in collective responsibility for the actions perpetrated by individuals. I don't think any of us ascribes to that. We see ourselves as individuals who are responsible for our individual actions. Having said that, because these crimes have been committed in the name of a faith, of my faith, I feel compelled to speak out, to condemn what's happened in the name of my faith, and to do my utmost to protect and the freedoms and the rights that we have here. I don't feel responsible for what happened in Ottawa or what happened in Paris, but I do feel a sense of responsibility to stand up against this cancer of extremism that seems to be spreading. That's what I can do as an individual.
Okay, let me just follow up and make sure I completely understand what you're saying here. Do you think there's anything that links you in any way to the Muslims who were responsible for what happened in Paris or Ottawa?
Anything tangible? No, I've never met them. I've never communicated with them. I don't follow their ideology. I frankly think that they come from a different planet than I do. I don't know what they're thinking, how they could even embark on that path. So no, I don't see anything tangible linking myself to them. The only thing that is linking me to them is that they have committed their actions in the name of a faith which I hold dear. And I will not let someone speak, if you like, in my name. And I agree with that hashtag, not in my name.
And therefore, you felt some kind of particular or special responsibility to speak out where perhaps others would not have felt that responsibility. Do I have that right?
That's right.
Okay. One last thing here. Did you find the Charlie Hebdo cartoons blasphemous?
I saw the ones that were published. Some of them were juvenile, but others were, the ones that were pornographic, I found extremely offensive. Extremely offensive, and I saw no purpose for that. I understand if you'd like to use satire to attack, for example, the extremists out there today, and there's a way to do that. But to denigrate the Prophet Muhammad, who is revered by at least 1 billion people in the world, I don't see the point in that.
Okay, I should actually get Ms. Halal on that as well. Did you find the cartoons blasphemous?
I would just say that the cartoons were offensive. I think that goes without saying. And I also think, when we're talking about the larger issue, I'm repeatedly concerned by the fact that what happened in Paris is reduced to an issue of free speech, because there are clearly other factors that are involved in this issue. And I also want to say, based on the research I've done, and there is a lot of research on this, the issue of the cartoon and the way that the media shapes negative social constructions of Muslims is a larger issue. It doesn't just stop at a cartoon, right? It affects the way that society views this group of people and the subsequent treatment that they get in society. So I think we also, in answering that question, need to think more broadly about what are the ramifications of such a cartoon, not just whether or not Muslims find it to be offensive.
Okay, just before we bring Professor Ferretti and Dr. Peterson into our conversation, we need to hear from a sage who always at times like this provides great wisdom on these matters. Here's Jon Stewart from The Daily Show. Roll tape.
Obviously, this is a terrible tragedy, one that we should condemn. Jason Jones.
You are darn right, John. I wholeheartedly condemn these acts and those responsible for them.
Yeah, and so do I. I definitely condemn them as well.
And John, yes, I, as a Muslim, of course, absolutely 100% unequivocally condemn these actions.
Yeah, I gotta be honest. I just did not feel that last one coming from him.
Yeah, I don't know. It just, Hassan's wasn't as condemning as I'd like.
Yeah. No, I know. I kind of felt that as well.
No. I condemn just as hard as you guys did.
No, guys. It's not.
I did.
It's not. It's not a contest. Although I think we can agree, Hassan, you could have put in, a little effort to that. I mean, all caps or something. I mean, that was.
No, that was all caps.
It wasn't sincere. I mean.
No. You think it would have been a little more, what's the word? Shameful.
Yes.
Right,
yes.
or just like denouncier.
Denouncier is a good word, I think.
Oh, I know what's going on. 'Cause I'm Muslim, I gotta be condemnier than you guys.
No, that's
No. You guys are holding me to a condemnier standard.
No.
Muslims around the world have already spoken out. The Arab League, French Muslim Religious Council, Muslim leaders in India, Spain, Austria, Ukraine, Australia, Lebanon, all have released statements of condemnation. In Paris, just to show how condemning we are and to honor the kosher supermarket victims, Muslims were holding I am Jewish signs.
I just don't even think you've condemned this yet.
Yeah.
The FBI is investigating a bombing outside the NAACP office in Colorado Springs.
Investigators released this sketch of a man they believe may have detonated the bomb.
What? Why would I condemn that? That dude's white. I mean, I do condemn it, but that's your job, Jones. That's not my thing.
I don't have to condemn that.
Nah, you white, Jason. You got to condemn that.
No. Okay. So now I'm responsible for some rogue extremist white guy? No. If I have to condemn that, then you have to condemn the entire city of Chicago. Black on black violence.
What? That I've never even been to Chicago.
No. If I gotta own up for all the crazy Muslims, you guys gotta own up for all the crazy things that your people do.
I'm sorry. What do you mean your people?
All right, no, listen, guys, listen, look. Maybe it's not necessary for each individual to have to own the worst actions of the people in their community. Maybe that's not necessary.
Oh,
Yeah.
look who's trying to get out of this. Yeah, Mr. Insider Trading.
What? No!
Yeah, Mr. Crash the economy.
No, my people didn't.
Captain, bail me out.
Okay. Frank Ferretti, let me go to you on this first. Do you think that Muslims are being asked to be, in the words of the broadcast there, denouncier or condemnier than other groups for misdeeds perpetrated by Muslims?
Well, yes and no. I think there's a backstory to this, which is that we live in a world where identity politics is very powerful, where we continually are judged in accordance with the group that we belong to, either ethnic or lifestyle or cultural. And we have a situation where, for example, just the other day, when something terrible happened in Palestine, people were saying that you Jews are responsible for that. Jews in Europe often make the point that whatever happens in Israel, they collectively are held to account, and no distinction is made between different groups of Jews. And similarly, if you go to universities in this country and other parts of Europe, you'll find that people relate to one another in a very segmented way, where it's assumed that every Swede is the same, every Muslim is the same, every Jew is the same, every gay person is the same. Every identity group is meant to somehow make us part of something that's more important than our humanity. I just think that what has happened is that given the global prominence that the issue of terrorism has achieved, the Muslim community has become disproportionately sort of targeted with this idea of collective responsibility. But I do think that whether we like it or not, we do live in a world of segmented cultural groups where we are held to be Jewish, that's the end of the story. We are held to be gay, that's the end of the story. We are held to be something, not as individual, but part of that kind of wider setting. And I think that's the context within which there's all this, what I think was very unhelpful sort of campaign to get Muslims, no matter what, which bit of the Islam religion they kind of come from, which ethnic group they are, to get them to somehow collectively denounce and apologize for actions which is not of their own making.
Let's now welcome to our discussion as well, in New York, Lisa Goldman, who is the co-founder and contributing editor at Plus 972. That's a Tel Aviv-based digital magazine. Ms. Goldman, good of you to join us tonight on TVO. And I wonder if I could get you to follow up where Frank Ferretti just left off, which is this notion that Muslims are now being asked to be, as Jon Stewart put it, denouncier or condemnier than other groups for the misdeeds that have been perpetrated by Muslims around the world. What's your view on that?
Oh, I agree. I think I saw that Jon Stewart clip, and I thought it was terrific. And I think one of the points he made was, and it was also made again in an article that I read in Foreign Policy, was that Muslims are not committing more terrorist attacks as a group than any other group. There are Christian terrorists, for example, the Lord's Army in Somalia, I think it is, or Sudan. There are individuals who commit terrorist attacks not in the name of religion, but in the name of other causes, nationalist causes, for example, like the Basques. So I personally have a really big problem with this idea of collective responsibility. I'm Jewish. I lived in Israel for most of my adult life. And when I was at university there were German students who would come as one-year exchange students or just one-year students going abroad, and they would spend quite a bit of their time doing volunteer work at retirement homes and so forth as a sort of a penance for the sins of their grandparents or great-grandparents, depending on how old they were. And I personally felt very, very uncomfortable with that. I didn't think that it was their I think awareness is very important, but apologizing for the acts of others is something that I'm very uncomfortable with. I think that sort of philo-Semitism or abjectly apologetic attitude can too easily flip to resentment, which is my pragmatic argument against collective responsibility.
So I think you've been clear about this, but just so I'm clear on what you're saying, when you hear something that, for example, the IDF is alleged to have done in Gaza, you don't feel some personal responsibility for that?
As an Israeli citizen?
Or as a Jew?
Not as a Jew. Well, no. But as as a tax-paying Israeli citizen and a resident of Israel, I did demonstrate against acts that I thought were immoral, that were committed by the army acting in my name, certainly. But I don't feel responsible as a Jew for the acts of every Jew in the world, no.
Okay, at this point, having set the table for what the discussion is, we need a good psychologist to explain to us why this is happening, or why this does happen. So Jordan, how would you explain what it is that makes us see in different groups, or makes us see different groups through the prism of some of the worst behavior of some of them?
Well, partly we tend to lump things we don't understand together. So until you have differentiated knowledge of a foreign society, you tend to see it as monolithic. And the reason for that is that you don't know any better. And so then the act of differentiation within that population comes along with being informed. And I suppose that's part of the reason why you hope for dialogue, because then you can understand and differentiate the people who belong to a given ethnic group or who belong to a given religious group. So, but the initial response generally to the foreign is apprehension and caution, and I would say among some people, disgust. And then you have to learn why that might not be appropriate. And it's not easy to learn that, and there are real deep reasons for that.
So what's the cure for that?
Well, I've been thinking about that for a long time, and with regards to responsibility, I think that it is necessary to take on your shoulders responsibility for the horrors that human beings are capable of perpetrating, because you are involved in it. Now, that doesn't mean that I should blame you or that I should blame your group, because that's not the same thing.
How are you involved in it?
By whatever you do that's immoral in your own life, because the actions that you take as an individual aren't dissociated from the social actions that play themselves out in the world. I mean, one of the things we learned from what happened in the 20th century in places like the Soviet Union, the whole Soviet society, is that it's the pathologies of the individual are integrally linked with the pathologies of the state. So, for example, in East Germany, 1/3 of the people there were informers. And people like Solzhenitsyn pointed out quite clearly, and Viktor Frankl as well, that the deceit that characterized individuals within their private life was part of what propagated and maintained the entire pathological society.
Okay, I see that connection though, but for example, if you're a Muslim who just goes about his or her daily life in Peterborough, Ontario or Windsor, Ontario, how are you in any way connected to any of what's gone on?
Well, it depends on how you go about your daily life. Like, see, there's a couple of issues here that are quite problematic. They're difficult to discuss. You asked the two Muslim panelists today whether they found the Charlie Hebdo cartoons blasphemous. They didn't answer. They told you they found them offensive, which is not what you asked. And there are questions here that have to be addressed that people are actually afraid of asking. So, for example, if I produce an image of the Prophet Muhammad, which I understand is a blasphemous act from the Islamic perspective, what is the appropriate response for a devout follower of Islam to me? I don't know the answer to that. So, to the degree that you're participating in processes that have effects that you can't understand, that go beyond your individual sphere of action, you are responsible in some indeterminate way for the action of the whole. It's not an easy thing to figure out, but you're not divorced from the whole. So, but that doesn't mean I should blame your group. That's a different thing, and those things need to be separated carefully.
Okay, you've put that on the record. Let's get some feedback on that. Shima Khan, do you want to come back on that?
Sure. Well, I mean, if I'm going to ascribe to what the professor said, then it applies both ways. Is our Aboriginal population here justified in blaming every single Canadian?
No, I said that blame wasn't appropriate, but that doesn't mean that every Canadian isn't responsible for taking on the weight of the historical past. I didn't say that anyone should be blamed. I said that people should take responsibility. That is not the same thing.
Taking responsibility for their 1/30 millionth of the solution, is that what you mean?
Well, I don't know if it's 1/30 millionth or not, because it depends on the specific conditions of your life. Like, let's assume for a moment that you're absolute.
Taking responsibility for what?
Sorry, I didn't.
Taking responsibility for what? I just want to understand where you're coming from. As a Canadian today who came here in 1965, who was totally unaware of what transpired with regards to our Aboriginal communities, what responsibility do I bear?
I don't know. That's up to you to figure out, because you're a historical creature and you're shaped by history, and you're also one of its beneficiaries. And it's not up to me to decide to what degree you're responsible. It's up to you to decide to what degree your actions as an individual citizen propagate themselves into social terrors of one form or another. And it's not that there's no connection, unless you think that there's some, evil cabal behind everything terrible that happens. And there's not. So we are connected to the action of the collective in ways that are very difficult to understand, and we have to take responsibility for that.
Well, let me raise another issue of collective responsibility, which one hears about. We talk about it on this program all the time, and that is something called white privilege. The idea that those who are here now must somehow pay some kind of price for the past, even if it's just feeling guilty about it. Frank Ferretti, let me bring you in on that. Do you find whites are made to feel responsible for things that happened a long time ago that they had no particular direct connection to?
I think there is a general tendency to guilt trip people, not just white people, but everybody. I think guilt tripping has become a very powerful 21st century accomplishment, cultural accomplishment. I think the very idea of white privilege, which is, I think, a very irrational concept, and actually emanates from within fairly narrow stratum of politically correct white people, in some shape or form, actually destroys the relationship between action and consequence. I think the only thing you can hold any of us to account, white, black, or any other sort of group, is in relation to what we've done. I think I, as an individual, bear responsibility for the consequences of my action, and that's the only basis on which an open, free, democratic society can be built. If I'm in some shape or form the bearer of my father's sin, which is what the whole idea of white privilege is really all about, then in a sense we go back to the old biblical sort of era where the individual barely exists as a phenomenon. What you have instead are really a very different kind of society, which I think has got fairly destructive consequences.
Lisa Goldman, let me just sort of follow up on your earlier comments where you suggested that because you're Jewish, there are those who would assign blame to you for everything that they don't like that the State of Israel does. Do you find that you as a white person as well are being asked to feel responsible for things that happened hundreds of years ago that you have no direct connection to?
That hasn't really been my experience, but look, every society and every group has its privileged segments. There's a richer class, there's gender privilege. There's a big difference between guilt for the acts of others, which is gratuitous and stupid and pointless and can backfire, and taking responsibility for your own actions. Every society has its privileged people. The question is, if you're one of those privileged people, what do you do to even the playing field? What do you do to rectify this sort of unjust makeup of our society?
Jordan, you wanted to follow up.
Well, the distinction between guilt and responsibility was laid out pretty pretty carefully there. You know, I wanted to give 3 examples. I mean, one's sort of a symbolic example. You see statues of Atlas carrying the world on his shoulders. So that's one example. Alexander Pope, I hope this is right, said, "I am a man and nothing that is human is foreign to me." And there's an idea in Christianity that Christ took the world of sins upon his shoulders. And then there's an idea from Viktor Frankl and Solzhenitsyn that, and Dostoevsky for that matter, that not only are you responsible for your own actions, but in some manner you're responsible for the actions of everyone else. So I'm bringing up those examples to point out that, you know, this idea that I'm promoting is hardly my idea or hardly novel. The issue is that people are tribal and they're vicious. And that's the case for everyone. And so then the question is, what do you do about that? And I don't think I should worry about the degree to which you're tribal and vicious. I think that I should worry about the degree to which I am. And then I should try to be alert enough in my own life and conscious enough so that I'm not propagating that into the future.
At this point, I think we can come to a consensus on one person in our collective lives who was vicious and evil, and that was Anders Breivik. I think everybody agrees he was vicious and evil. And the question that I want to pose that emerges from the tragedy that he perpetuated some time ago was the notion that people apparently didn't say after his terrorist attack, all you Norwegian Christians have to apologize for the fact that Breivik did what he did. We didn't do that to him. There are many of us who do that to Muslims. And Shima, I understand we're going to lose our satellite to you in about 2 minutes, so let me give you the first crack at this. Is it a fair analogy that that apparently we are not forcing on Norwegian Christians the same kind of standards we apparently do on, or many of us do anyway, against Muslims?
Well, I think it comes down to familiarity. Those of us living in the Western Europe know more about, if you like, Norwegians or European culture or history than we do about Muslims. As the professor said, when you have sort of a foreign entity, which Muslims are to a certain extent, there is more fear initially. And you will have this more visceral, if you like, broad-based prejudicial reaction than to a group that is known. This is why, for example, we don't blame all white police officers for what's happened in the States with regards to the deaths of young black men. This is why we don't blame all white Christians for the actions of a few, because those of us who live here know, we work with them, we know them, we know that it's a small minority. But I think until we have greater familiarity and interaction with Muslims, then people realize that just like everyone else, we're diverse, we're not a monolith. We like to live here and raise our kids and send them to school and have a good life like everyone else. And we're not all that different from everyone else. But that's going to take time.
Shima, thanks so much for joining us on TVO tonight. As always, appreciate your participation in our programs.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, take good care. Frank Freddy, let me get you to follow up. How do you explain the type of fear that comes up in our public conversations about Muslims that obviously does not come up when we talk about Norwegian Christians, for example?
Well, I think, first of all, the analogy with Norway is false, because in Norway what you had was a Norwegian nationalist committing a terrible crime against other Norwegians, and that's kind of perceived in slightly different ways than something that seems to have two different groups at war with each other. But I do think there is a sense in which, because of the whole globalized nature of the crisis, the fact that Muslims and Western society have always had a troublesome relationship historically, I think it's always been the case that the Muslim terrorist, as a kind of caricature, has always, ever since the 1970s, haunted the imagination and has been a resource that many politicians and moral entrepreneurs drew on as a way of pathologizing the reaction of Muslim communities throughout the world. And that's been really, really very interesting that has had such a long period. I think what's interesting now is that for the first time, what we have is not just this exceptional focus on Muslim responsibility, but we also are beginning to have, particularly in Europe, an almost asymmetrical reaction against Jews, where Belgian or French or German Jews are increasingly held to be complicit with whatever Israel does. And although this is at the moment on a lower scale and hasn't got the heightened intensity that anti-Islamic sentiments have, I think it's well worth watching, because I think in many respects the reaction against Islam in Western societies provides a paradigm that may well be applied to other communities.
Ms. Halal, can I get you to comment on this issue? Well, funnily enough, I mean, this may be one area where Muslims and Jews have something in common. This notion of collective responsibility seems to be placed at their doorsteps far more than it ever does at the doorsteps of, for example, Norwegian Christians. Do you see that?
When you talk about what happened in Norway, although the guy was a nationalist, he was also a right-wing terrorist. I mean, he had very Christian leanings. His manifesto that he left behind specifically invoked Christianity as a rationale. But yet, because of this white privilege, he was not, no one in the Christian community was expected to provide some kind of apology, was expected to speak out in any capacity whatsoever. So that to me is a function of white privilege. And I think another issue, a larger issue that we have to consider here, is that the structures we're talking about are not inevitable. It doesn't, I mean, if the media is choosing to be intentional and is actively trying to pursue the truth, they will try to present a broader picture of who Muslims are. This is not something that is difficult at this point in time. I mean, Muslims are connected via internet. There are communities. If someone is truly interested in seeing the diversity of Muslims, they are fully capable and fully able, and to me, it poses no challenge whatsoever.
Let's get some feedback to what you said, because I had Jordan Peterson shaking his head in front of me, and I saw Lisa Goldman nodding her head on the monitor as well. So, Lisa, why don't you respond first, and then we'll get Jordan in.
Well, first of all, I want to just also underline the fact that Anders Breivik did specifically write that he was acting in the name of Christian Europe. And I think, you know, Europe is a strange thing. It has this sort of, in its post-war state, it has, you know, it's very famous for being a welfare state and a welfare society and a liberal society, but I think that's not really the case. Yascha Mounk, writing in Foreign Affairs last month, he's a Harvard PhD who is also a fellow at the New America Foundation. He wrote that, you know, as a German Jew, from his perspective, that Europe really is sort of, it has a problem with others. It just isn't that comfortable with non-whites and non-Christians for all its secularism. And I think that's a really important point. And he took that a bit further, and he said, you know, the far-right politicians like Marine Le Pen, for example, you know, they are sort of playing the Jewish and Muslim communities against one another to their benefit. And I think we should look at that and be more aware of that. I have a really big problem with this idea that Europe and the European Christian society and Muslim society has historically been involved in some, you know, millennia-old conflict. I think it's really important to examine the after effect of European colonialism, especially French colonialism in North Africa. I think you can't deny that this is a huge factor in the discontent of French-speaking North Africans who, you know, French-speaking French citizens who are of North African extraction feel very marginalized, and perhaps they have come to identify more strongly as Muslims in their search for identity as adults. But I think that their resentment really comes from having been rejected as fully French.
Jordan.
This is a psychological proposition. If you can't imagine taking pleasure in being a prison guard in Auschwitz, you don't know anything at all about yourself or people.
Because the fact is you can.
Directed at me?
Not only can you, people do. And not only do they, there's no reason to assume that it's not normative. I mean, look at the world. I mean, we spent the time from 1945 to 1989 worried that we were going to blow ourselves up with hydrogen bombs, right? And then We don't know how many tens of millions of people died in the 20th century because of political oppression and individual acts of evil, but there's like hundreds of millions. The Germans voted for the Nazis. The Russians lied themselves into Stalin. It's like, why are we even arguing about whether or not that's an intrinsic part of human nature? You have to learn to be good.
It seems to me that if you explore the concept, then you realize that underneath it is the very same impulse that perceives groups collectively. The very fact that it's white privilege and that whiteness is essential feature of people that defines and gives attributes to people's role in life, I think is as mistaken as to assume that all Muslims or all Jews have this kind of Pavlovian reaction and Pavlovian behavior in relation to certain events. In the real world, not the world that's been projected, there are poor whites, working class white people, there are middle class whites who have a very distorted view of the world in academia, there are ruling class, powerful whites who run the media and have a disproportionate amount of power, not because they're white, but because of their economic and social resources at their disposal. And white society, to be frank, is as heterogeneous as that of Muslim society or any other group we care to look at. And it seems to me that there's a danger of adopting a double standard where we somehow can see the fault in certain kinds of criticisms that are being made against certain kinds of groups, but somehow absolve ourselves of an act of self-criticism in relation to our own communities.
I take it that that's a clock and not some social commentary on the value of what's being proposed here.
I think it's both, probably, yes.
Okay. Let me do this with, what do we got, about less than 10 minutes to go here, and I want to make sure we get to this before we run out of time. There's a public polling organization in Canada called Environic Survey, and from time to time they do survey public opinion on the issue of Muslims in Canada. And admittedly, this is a 2007 survey. They're in the field again now doing something more up to date. But let's just put these numbers out here and then we'll comment on them and see what we think. Sheldon, I'm in the middle of page 5 here, if you could bring this graphic up. When asked whether they thought most Muslims wanted to, quote, adopt Canadian customs and way of life, or, quote, be distinct from the larger Canadian society, 55% of Muslims said they believe most Muslims wanted to adopt Canadian customs. An additional 13% believed their co-religionists wanted both to adopt Canadian customs and remain distinct as a community. Just about a quarter of Canadian Muslims, 23%, believed that most of their co-religionists in Canada wanted to remain distinct from the wider Canadian society. I wonder whether we have any agreement of this gathering here that the perception of Muslims as being too distinct from the rest of society reinforces a prejudice which comes to the fore when Islam-inspired terrorism creates headlines around the globe. Lisa, do you want to weigh in on that first?
Yeah, actually I do. I was just thinking about, you know, as a member of the Jewish tribe, so to speak, you know, there is a subculture, the Hasidic Jews, the ones that they'd have a very distinctive style of dress amongst the men, the black and white with the hats and so forth. And because of their religious practices demand, you know, demand that they live in a sort of a community physically, they do tend to self-ghettoize. I personally wish they wouldn't, but I think it's absolutely their choice. And there are plenty of communities, especially in Canada, which does tend to, especially if you look at Toronto, for example, it does tend to be a sort of a self-ghettoizing city. You have all sorts of what we call ethnic neighborhoods, where the street signs are in certain languages and so forth. People like to be amongst their own. I don't have a problem with that. I think that the issue is, do you work and pay taxes? Are you a productive member of society? Are you kind to your neighbors? Do you refrain from littering? Surely those, do you vote? Surely those are the issues we should care about rather than the language one speaks in one's neighborhood or one's manner of dress or anything of that matter. I don't really know what Canadian customs are actually, and I'm a fourth generation. I was born in Canada. My grandparents on both sides were born in Canada, and I have no idea what Canadian customs are.
A lot of people are still trying to figure that out. You're not alone, Lisa. Go ahead, Jordan. Follow up if you would.
We never really wrestle with the deeper issues of multiculturalism, you know. So let's say that you do want to stay within your group. It's like, yeah, I understand that. It's an integral part of human nature, but it's problematic. So you want to stay within your group. Okay, what if my daughter falls in love with your son?
Then what?
Then what? Well, you know, are you protecting your culture, or are you passing the most extreme value judgment possible on my daughter? Which is it? Now, that's the sort of thing we don't talk about, because we think that multiculturalism is something that's easy.
Obviously, people do intermarry, and that's their choice. Some people choose to self-ghettoize. It's not imposed on them. And some people choose to cross those boundaries, those self-imposed boundaries, and that's their choice as well. There are some members of the Jewish community who oppose intermarriage, and you know, that's something that you know, they might, for example, hypothetically disown a child who married a non-Jew. Again, that's an individual choice, but it's not, you know, there's no physical punishment. No one's going to jail them or kill them.
We often have wide-ranging conversations on this program, and I'd say tonight's, which started talking about terrorism and ended talking about marriage, would fit that bill. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight on TVO. Frank Furedi, Maha Hilal, Lisa Goldman, and Jordan Peterson. Appreciate your contributions to a, as we suggested off the top, complicated but important subject worth delving into. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.